Okay, so basically, we're going to talk about digital technology and the future of elections. And we started off structuring this panel with the premise that basically with digital technology, we recognize that it is frankly easier and cheaper in a sense to really interfere with our elections on a broad scale and to undermine faith in the election process. And really this happens at least in two major ways. One being with respect to the mechanics of the election process, registration, voting, variety of issues related to that. And then also, obviously, in the context of online manipulation and disinformation tactics that can also infect, in a sense, the conversation around elections. And these are two areas that, frankly, I find are frequently talked about in silos in a way. And I think in part because that's just different expertise in many respects that come to play in this. And in many ways, what we're going to be doing is combining the expertise and talking about these issues together. Because as you'll see, when you get to Secretary of State Warner here, he has to deal with both, in effect, in the context of our elections. And we've thought about this, why is it so important? From my perspective, important because interfering in our elections and undermining the confidence in our elections can effectively affect voter participation, obviously, in this context. It can affect whether or not you accept the outcome. It can infect the public dialogue, the civic dialogue that we're having in relation to our elections. All of these things are critical to the strength of our democracy. And this is what we're hoping to do is talk about what are the threats today, in effect, but also what can we do moving out into the future to really improve these issues, to really address some of the threats that we see as a consequence of some of the trends of digital technology that bring us so much value in some respects, but also create these sort of vulnerabilities that we've looked about. So we have this incredible panel. Josh Benaloh, who is a senior cryptographer at Microsoft Research, but also is an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington in the context of computer science and engineering. And Josh has been working on election security issues for decades, I believe. If I recall, you did your dissertation at Yale in part on an election security issue, and most recently participated in a National Academy of Sciences group that looked at the future of voting, security of voting, how to protect American democracy, and really dug into a lot of these sort of technical issues that are critical to doing so. And so that's Josh. And then we have Renee DiResta, remarkable woman who's also the head of policy and for Data for Democracy. Mozilla Fellow. And a Mozilla Fellow, right? And also, most importantly, right, you're also an associate at Columbia's Data Science Institute as well. But among many things and research that you've been doing for years, you were also the lead author on the Senate Intelligence Committee's, I think, commissioned report on the interference in the 2016 election, Russian interference. So really incredible expertise that Renee brings to us. And then Secretary of State Mac Warner for West Virginia, and I think, are you the 30th elected Secretary of State, West Virginia, in this area? And besides being a West Point grad and somebody who served many years in public service, I think including 5 years in Afghanistan and doing work with the military, you have been recognized for your innovation in the context of cybersecurity and in thinking through elections and how it is that we can improve our process moving forward. And I think will really bring some interesting perspective to this issue that we don't often get to hear from in this context. So that's our panel. What we're going to do is basically ask each of our panelists to talk a little bit about how they perceive the threat and what are some of the opportunities for the future. We will then have an opportunity for, I'll drill them with some questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A for the audience. So let me start with Josh, if that's all right.
Surely. Thank you, Avril. It's a real pleasure to be here. Is the mic on? No. Okay, I'll just talk. Now it's on? Perfect. So thank you. As I say, it's a pleasure to be here. I find myself in something of an unusual position today because I typically find myself as the last speaker on a panel where the speakers before me have scared everybody about the vulnerabilities of our election infrastructure. And I sort of close up by picking up the pieces and adding a little bit of hope at the end. I guess today I'm responsible excuse me, for setting a little bit of context beforehand. So I do want to sort of raise the issues of this National Academies report that Avril mentioned at the beginning. It was a true honor to serve on this committee. I spent most of the last few years on this. One of the co-chairs was a fellow named Lee Bollinger. I believe he's
I think we know who he is,
some sort of academic official, I'm not sure, an administrator at a college somewhere. We didn't try to address all the issues with elections. Of course, it's multifaceted. Disinformation is a huge issue, voter suppression, gerrymandering, there are so many issues. We focused mostly on the technology having to do with casting and counting of votes. And we learned quite a lot. We did learn about a very vulnerable infrastructure. I'd like to offer a quote from Alex Halderman, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, who has said that his undergraduate security class could have changed the results of the 2016 election. And I believe him. Some of the things he discovered in the Michigan recounts afterwards, some of the vulnerabilities are jaw-dropping. I'm not trying to place blame on this. We got here in a set of circumstances that's really hard to capture, and we wind up in this position. Election officials have very little choice in what to do right now. The marketplace is not really functional right now, so it's a problem that we need to find a way out of. And we can certainly do better. We can bring up the standards of our election security infrastructure to much better standards than they are now. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that no matter how much we can do there, it's not enough to make our elections impervious to attack. And part of the problem that we have is that elections are run in the US at the local level, mostly counties, in some cases townships. There are over 8,000 election jurisdictions in the US. And the attackers now are sometimes nation states. And we have some of the most dedicated public servants in state government and county government, but expecting a local county government IT manager to be able to build a system that withstands an attack from the Russian FSB or APT-1 in Shanghai or something from North Korea, it's just not realistic. But there is something that we can do. And again, the report talks about this at length. We can audit our elections so that even if we can't absolutely guarantee that they can't be tampered with, we can check and see whether or not they have been tampered with and know with certainty, or very close to certainty, whether or not an election is good. If an election came out fine, we know, okay, this was good. If there was tampering, we can detect that. And there are two principal means of enabling auditing. One is a method of public auditing that's become very popular in the last few years called risk limiting auditing. Sorry, I called that public auditing. I meant administrative auditing. What you might think of as auditing typically is you go in and you randomly pick some precincts or some ballots and you check them against what you expect and you see how well things match. And risk limiting audits do that, but they do that in a very efficient and dynamic way so that you can very quickly get high certainty in the result of an election. And the other means of auditing is something which has not been widely deployed, except in a few small experimental cases. That's a public form of auditing that's called end-to-end verifiability. This allows members of the public, individual voters, to check for themselves that their votes have been properly recorded and properly counted, that everything is done properly without having to even trust election officials or the equipment. You don't have to believe anybody. You can check it for yourself. So these are the two principal mechanisms that are involved, and I'm happy to talk more about them. But one thing that I'd like to share, because it's very, very current, Avril knows quite a lot about this, is that earlier just this week, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella announced a program which is joint with Columbia and a few others to build this technology, both end-to-end verifiability and better, more privacy-enhanced risk-limiting auditing tools. The tools are going to be freely available, open source. Anybody can use them. We're working with vendors now, trying to encourage them to use this so that our election infrastructure can have much greater integrity than it does now, and allow people to check and make sure everything is good. So I look forward to talking more about that, either in questions or afterwards. Thank
Excellent.
you.
All right. Oh, my mic's on. Okay. Thanks for having me here today. I'm on California time, so I'm going to use my notes because I'm waking up. I did a lot of research over the last year into election interference, specifically through the Russian operation, which was not solely election interference. It was much broader than that. It began in 2014 and was continuing well through 2017, 2018. And so my area of expertise is much more on influence operations. But what's interesting about the Russian operation is that it was a multi-pronged approach. So there is evidence that there was interference with voting machines specifically. There is evidence of the GRU, military intelligence, conducting a series of hack and leak operations, the DNC and the Clinton campaign, both two separate operations there. And then the social influence campaign, which is what you have likely seen the memes for. That's the Russian Internet Research Agency. What's interesting about that social influence operation was one distinct thing carried out by what is, on the surface looks like a third-party contractor, but with extremely strong ties to the Russian government. The GRU did in fact also run its own social influence operation in the component of releasing the hacked documents. And so one of the things that we're very interested in now is to what extent was there coordination between those two operations. And the Mueller report recently begins to kind of extend into that facet of the conversation, which is still working to understand it. So when we look at the Internet Research Agency social influence operation, what they did over a period of years was they worked to divide America into a series of tribes. So it's often framed in the media as create divisions, but the way that they did that was actually by solidifying feelings of pride. So you as a member of a certain tribe should feel a certain way about a certain issue or a certain candidate. And so it wasn't really framed as American against American. It was many of the pages, for example, targeted the black community, and the narratives there were, as black Americans, we don't like Hillary Clinton. As black Americans, we don't like X. And so it was much more of a creating a series of like kind of social cohesion, bonding almost, and then they would activate the political only actually maybe 10% of the time. The remainder of it was, as black Americans, we have a lot of pride in this. As black Americans, we enjoy this. And so it was really a building and reinforcing these cultural bonds. The same thing was done on the right, the same thing was done on the left. It was very interesting to watch the sophistication of the segmentation of American society and the ways in which they understood how to inflect the right message for the right people. So the right, for example, was not treated as a monolith. It was actually subdivided itself, where there was the young right, which received a lot of kind of meme culture type content, Breitbart articles, Turning Point USA, media properties that would resonate with that audience. And then the older right would get these memes about Ronald Reagan, nostalgia for the America that used to be. And so there was a high degree of sophistication, even in the segmentation there, around how to inflect the right message for the right people. In terms of the election specifically, there were a number of different ways in which they made efforts to interfere. The most notable of which, and this is where when people talk about the Internet Research Agency as a social media agency, what they miss is the extent to which they actively infiltrated communities. So it wasn't just targeting them with memes, it was actually finding the influencers and then giving them resources. So for example, hiring a Hillary Clinton impersonator to show up to a rally. They had about 81 events that were in the real world that were related either to divisive issues like Confederate monuments or victims of officer-involved violence. And what they would do with these is they would use it to kind of create a spectacle that would then become a media story that would then be incorporated into the American media and the election narratives around, the narratives around issues in the American election. So it was much more sophisticated than simply pushing out content. And that's something that we're still trying to think about. How do you deal with that when you have, that is an actual spying campaign at that point. You are actually recruiting an American to unwittingly serve as an agent of a foreign power, to stage protests, to take actions, and to do things that perhaps align with their values, but they don't realize who they are acting on behalf of. There was voter suppression. That was mostly done through the outward meme-facing content. So the question becomes, what is the platform responsibility for looking for evidence of that kind of voter suppression? That usually took 3 types: either wrong information, telling people to go vote in the wrong place. That was mostly focused on the Latino community. There was discouragement. So that was the, as members of this particular racial or ethnic group, we can't support Hillary Clinton. And then there was advocacy for third-party candidates. So that's a little bit less on the suppression front, but really driving people to not vote, or telling them blatantly false things like, if you voted for Bernie in the primary, you can't vote for Hillary in the election. So we know that there was a sufficient amount of engagement with this content. The thing that we're still struggling with is to what extent it had impact. And impact in terms of, did it flip the election, is one question, and we don't have an answer to that, of course. There's another form of impact, though, which is the messages that were presented to the communities continue to be shared today. So the Russian memes continue to be shared. They're still all over Instagram. And they're being shared by real Americans who are members of these targeted communities, who do feel a substantial amount of affinity for the message. And so it gets at one of the interesting challenges here is, what do you do when foreign propaganda resonates with Americans because there is a sufficient number of people who feel that way? And this is where there are interesting challenges with social platforms around amplification of divisive content, not being able to take down fake accounts that seed this content quickly enough. And then the real goal of the propagandist in this situation is, if you make it trend on a social platform, it's going to achieve so much amplification. It's going to become a story. So what do you do about the fact that we have this narrative laundering tool that allows anybody to go and seed a narrative, get it into the cultural zeitgeist, and get it in some way onto Hannity or into the New York Times? So it becomes this interesting information laundering ecosystem, where as we think about the political messages we're receiving, there's an increasing amount of distrust in where is the message coming from. And unfortunately, one of the reasons that this is so effective is that now there's suspicion among regular, ordinary people. You'll go onto Twitter and you'll see people accusing other people of being bots, Russian bots. That is probably not the case, but that doesn't preclude people from doing it. And that's because there's this sense of unease, this sense of not knowing what's real and feeling like it takes so much effort to find that out. So when we think about how this erodes trust, from an electorate, it's really routing people to continue to entrench in specific silos, as opposed to listen to a diverse source of opinions or engage with their fellow citizens. And I think one of the things that's challenging here, in particular, as we think about the social ecosystem in the context of the last panel, is that democracies are disproportionately vulnerable because of the First Amendment. Because when a piece of content goes up on a social platform, we're extremely reluctant to take it down. There's a lot of concern that a false positive is silencing somebody. And so what that means, though, is that things stay up perhaps longer than they should and do have the opportunity to go viral, and nobody is really paying attention to the correction, or the correction is never going to go viral. The fact that an account was a malign account is actually going to be disputed by some percentage of the population that either reshared the content or felt an affinity for it. So it's one of the interesting challenges going forward is, we did see this activity in 2018. We see Iran doing it now. There's a lot of concern about China. There's really no evidence of any kind of Chinese targeted social media amplification operation the way that the Russians did, but this is something that people are beginning to say, that as sophisticated state actors, domestic ideologues, anyone can misuse this ecosystem in this way. So how do we think about hardening our social information environment, both in terms of what the platforms can do, but also in terms of educating citizens that this is in fact happening?
Really interesting, thank you. Please, Secretary.
I'd like to start by first thanking Dean Janow, for organizing this in Columbia, hosting this, and for the participation. These panels are just fabulous. I'm Mac Warner. I'm the West Virginia Secretary of State, and so I guess I'm getting to bat the cleanup that you talked about, Josh, earlier. Once the problems are presented out there, I've got to hold this together in a state, and I'm out with 49 other states, trying to hold the confidence of the people in our elections. So what I want to put out to you, the bottom line up front, is our elections are secure. The narrative that they're vulnerable and we have problems is one that I do need to go back to the silo analogy and break this down for you, because if you don't, then it gets wrapped into this one big, we got problems. Well, let me break it down for you. You start with, I put it into 6 components, and the first and the last are the same. You start with the people, okay? And last night I had that opportunity to go to the Billy Joel's 70th birthday, okay, over at Madison Square Garden. And as I looked out there at the 20-some thousand people in Madison Square Garden, I'm saying, okay, that's who we're dealing with, okay? A diverse, people population. You had young, you had old, black, white, all different ethnicities. You had different religions, different sexual orientation people, everybody, okay? So you start with that. And now we start to look at the voting process, actually electing someone to office. Okay, so you start with a registration process, okay, and who is allowed to register? So we start breaking away citizens from non-citizens, okay, that sort of thing. Age, okay, the state has a reason, a rational basis for setting up regulations. 18-year-olds, okay, it used to be 21, 26th Amendment moved it to 18, now there's a push to go to 16. Why not 14, 12, 10? What's the rational place that you break that off, all right? So then you have to be a resident of the place where you're voting, okay, a legal resident. So you start slicing these things away as to who is going to actually be registered. Now once you have that registered population, now let's get to the actual voting, okay? The voting is the machines. It's the avotronics, the express vote, a paper ballot, an absentee ballot, a mail-in ballot. Those are the ways that you actually cast a vote. Then you have the tabulation of that vote. And remember Stalin's famous quote, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes that matter, okay? It shows the importance of the tabulation part of this. You can have all this other stuff taken care of on the front end, but if you don't tabulate it correctly, you got a problem. Then you have election night reporting, okay? This is where those tabulated votes get reported to the people, and now I go back to the 6th stage, and that's the people again. And if you don't have the trust at the outset, then those people that are registered may not even go to register, but the people that are registered may not go to vote, okay? And on the back end, and what we saw after the 2016 election, the Russians didn't stop just at Election Day. 4 days after the election, they were trying to put people in the streets of New York City, both pro-Trump and pro-Hillary, to argue with one another. And what were they doing? They're trying to get inside our heads not to trust the election, that he wasn't legitimately elected and so forth. So both on the front end and the back end, the key is holding the integrity of the process and holding the confidence of the people in the election process. So don't buy it when you hear the elections are vulnerable. Not one vote in 2016 or 2018 was changed that we know of. Now, you just mentioned part of your discussion, said something about the Russians were hacking the election. Tried. Okay, they tried, but did not succeed, okay? So I break it down, and now I want to go back real quickly to the question that was asked over here about the education. I got very frustrated with our own Department of Homeland Security. I was elected in 2016 in February. First, I want to put it into context here. In January, right before the Obama administration left, their Department of Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, named elections as critical infrastructure. And within a month, all the secretaries of states were meeting in Washington, D.C., and there was pushback. We actually had a resolution that said, we don't want elections to be critical infrastructure. There was concern that the federal government was going to come in and control the elections. Part of, I think, the strength of our democracy is we have 50 different states, 50 laboratories, different ways of casting those votes, tabulating the votes, and so forth. It's very hard to hack in when you have 50 different systems. And that's what the secretaries were pushing back. But within a month of that, The new administration had come in, and now the Trump administration validated what the Obama administration had done and kept elections as critical infrastructure. At that point, it got all of our attention, and it's, are we going to be with them or against them? Both sides of the spectrum are saying this is important. It's highly, there are things that are going on that she knew about, certain people knew about, the three-lettered agencies knew about, but they weren't telling those of us who were the elections officials what was going on. It was a very frustrating year. It took us a full year. We met again in August of 2017, and they still weren't telling us. That we knew that there were 21 states, actually they targeted all 50, but 21 states they had extra efforts to try to penetrate, and they actually got inside of 2, and we just found out through the Mueller report that it was actually a 3rd state that they got into in the voter registration system. So I go back to those silos that I talked about, the voter registration system, which is attached to the internet because we want people to online register, make it easy and so forth. It is vulnerable. There are weaknesses, okay? But very limited. Three states that got hacked. The voting, you just heard, was attempted, but they didn't penetrate. The tabulation, they didn't penetrate. So where the Russians are going, and Renee is correct, it's in that, I talk body, mind, and spirit. Body is the hard physical stuff, the voting machines, they can't get in. The mind is the process by which we register people, we tabulate absentee ballots and so forth. The Russians did penetrate that a little bit. Where they're really going is the spirit of America, and that is our acceptance of our elected officials, the elected process, social media. So they're at the both ends, the people on the front end telling them not to vote, and I've got, back to the education real quick. I got so frustrated with it, I worked with DHS and I actually developed a slide presentation to educate the public. It's on my website, the West Virginia Secretary of State's website. Go dig it up. But here are examples of the Trump rally. Okay, here it is, Islam in Houston, Texas. I give 5 examples. One, Stacey Abrams in Georgia. That's this one, where the simple photoshopping, manipulating the data and so forth. When you hear about the Russian manipulation, here it is. Mueller report spells it out in words. We spell it out in pictures. So you actually see that actual manipulation occurring. And so that is my effort to try to get out and educate the people that when you see this sort of thing, and we give some examples of real stuff and fake stuff, this is my effort to try to get that education out there so that the public knows when they see, or senses. Sometimes when you see these, memes and so forth, a red flag should go off and say, whoa, hold it. Is that real or not real? And there's a good chance it is coming from the Russians, given what we've just heard.
Your point about, and you put this on your slide presentation, so we don't have evidence that any particular vote was affected, right, in the context of the 2016 election. And this idea that at least the voting process itself is to some extent secure from your perspective, right? And yet, we still have these enormous challenges that you've recognized and that all of us have been talking about. And I guess one way of thinking about it might be, and I'm putting out a statement for your reaction in a sense, but if you really say, okay, look, the actual voting, we don't have evidence that any particular vote was affected. What Josh's discussion of an audit does is it gives essentially credibility to that, right? It gives people confidence that that is in fact true if they're able to then go and check to see whether or not their vote was counted and recorded accurately, right? And that's a piece of the challenge that we're facing. But then we also have all of these issues associated with how essentially the public dialogue is being affected surrounding the election. So the kinds of divisions that Renee talked about in the tribal sort of approach to disinformation and misinformation and how we do it, and what you try to educate people through in the context of your presentation. And that presumably can affect whether or not people go to vote, which in a way is a kind of an affecting the vote in a sense, right? It can affect whether or not they vote for one candidate over another. It's just incredibly hard to figure out whether or not some particular piece of information that they read affected that. And moreover, it can affect their acceptance of the outcome and ultimately, essentially, the political power that people have then to, pursue a particular agenda in that context. And I guess from that perspective, what are the things that government should be doing in order to actually help address those issues? How do you see that?
Let me start by saying that every state does have audits. They have pre-election testing of the equipment and post-election audits. What Josh is getting at is a better system, okay? I make the analogy to cars, you know. I'm driving up until a year ago, I was driving a 2005 vehicle. I moved up to 2015. Still not all the way up to 2019 or whatever. What he's offering is a better system with more security. Now cars have videos, you know, all the way around and backup. Okay, those are better, they're safer, but the car that we had still was functioning. It was still safe. It was a whole lot better than something 50 years ago. And so I applaud Microsoft's efforts here with their election guard. It's fabulous hearing that they may be able to come in, and I applaud what's happening at Harvard, the Belfer Center, the Defending Digital Democracy, where Robbie Mook, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, and Matt Rhodes, Romney's campaign manager, both campaigns got hacked, and they're coming together at Harvard and helping get training manuals out for campaigns all over the United States. I love what Columbia's talking about doing and sending people to the field to talk to actual voters and see whether they accept the outcomes and whether their elections are secure and so forth. These are great roles for institutions to do, and I applaud the corporate effort of a Microsoft. And at these initial meetings, way back 2 years ago, right after 2016 election, when we knew something had happened but they hadn't disclosed what, here was Facebook, Twitter, Google. They were at these meetings with the FBI, CIA, all these, and then secretaries of state. We all came together to start trying to tackle this. And now I see this corporate effort to try to continue and improve. A wonderful interaction of Americana coming together, because this isn't a left or right, Republican, Democrat problem. This is an American problem, and we're all working to tackle it.
I couldn't agree more, but Secretary, let me just push you a little bit on this, because I think you raised an issue that strikes me as a critical one, which is the sharing of information, for example, between the federal government and the states. And I think from my own experience in national security, I saw how long it took to develop the kind of communication structure that we have, for example, in the context of counterterrorism between the federal government and state and local authorities, right? Yeah. And, in 2016, it was pretty clear to me we didn't have anything like a sufficient structure to share information. And I think, the current administration has done coordination councils, other things to try to affect that. Is it improving? Is it better? Is there more room to be made? And then I'd love Renee's thoughts too on these. Yeah.
It definitely is improving, much better. MS ISAC, ISAC, these multi-state and election groups coming together, election specialists and all across the United States coming together to share information. Now we've opened this up. We're actually testing it. We actually have twice a year tests now where we get together. One's coming up here in a week or so, where we all get online. And what I've done is taken it to the campaign level, where in the West Virginia Senate race, Manchin-Morrissey race, Manchin's campaign was actually hacked. And so now what is my obligation to go to try to help that? And here you had a Democrat campaign. I'm a Republican Secretary of State. My interjection into that causes issues or whatever. And so we need to streamline it, get it on paper where you don't have a Republican, Democrat stuff coming in. Here's just the approved solution. It's back to the Army and an SOP. And this is an incident response plan. We're working with Harvard, getting that back out. So there are a number of things that we can do, and it is getting a whole lot better than what we had before. But then you've got this Trump dynamic, okay? He doesn't want to talk about the Russian interference because it somehow thinks that it cheapens or draws into question his election. So there's a social part of this that we all have to tackle together. Like I said, it's not left or right. We need to solve it as Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that gap, unfortunately. I think at some point it became impossible to divorce collusion from interference, and that is a huge problem because that is so linked in the minds of kind of certain parts of the population who are strong supporters of the president that there is a resistance, like a complete inability to internalize that this did happen. I want to add one other thing that anecdote-wise. There were calls for armed insurrection leading into the election, actually, that the Russians were putting out in the far-right groups. It was all about rage. Get people out. They were advocating that people bring their guns to the polling place and stand there and defend the election. They were calling for the Oath Keepers to show up, saying the Oath Keepers are going, why aren't you? Right? So this was not, this was outright calls for riots in the streets if Hillary were to quote unquote steal the election. Immediately after the election results come in, there are calls for people to go protest in the streets that the Electoral College is illegitimate, targeted at the black community and the left community. So it's a seamless pivot where the rage focus is just redirected to the group that just lost. And that kind of thing it's remarkable, the ability to just seamlessly from one post to the next. I put out a report, it's on disinformationreport.com, and I went through chronologically every single thing they did in the week of the election and just broke that out. So for anyone who's interested in trying to understand the granularity there. As far as stopping it, there's researchers and I think civil, there was a lot of tension between people outside of the platforms and people inside of the platforms, just speaking about what I know. In 2016, immediately after the election, the first response was there's no way that Facebook could have been used to do this, right? Meanwhile, on Twitter that night, you could see Twitter engineers saying like, whoa, what happened here? And it was less about Russia and more just about trolling and division and harassment and the harassment mobs, and actually just what had happened to our dialogue and our ability to communicate as Americans. Gradually, it turned into looking at foreign interference. 2018 was much better as far as our ability to share information. There were, Facebook and the other platforms had what they called the war rooms. There was communication happening, and this is where you start to see the public-private partnerships come into play, where it's extremely hard to find this stuff. It only gets better. The information that I had from the platforms in the 2014 to 2017, they were sloppy. They were actually phenomenally sloppy. They used VPNs that were attributable. They registered Twitter accounts using Beeline Russia phones that were pretending to be people in Baltimore, right? So there were things that you could see then. That's not happening anymore. And that's where the real challenge comes into play, because this is no longer just the low-hanging fruit of some social media companies being able to figure out what account is real or fake. And so where we are now is much more looking at this as there's a signals intelligence problem here. How is the information amplified? A human intelligence problem, as they infiltrate communities and make Americans do the amplification themselves rather than creating it. These are the kinds of things where you're only able to identify these operations and attribute them by, one person sees a signal, says this looks a little bit off. Now we have a pipeline for how do we get that to the relevant researcher, whether that's within the platform, within the FBI, within a Department of Homeland Security or one of the others. We're trying to do a little bit more in the way of information sharing. The challenge is you don't want to. We're never looking at the narrative. It's a little bit more almost the dissemination pattern. What does anomalous dissemination look like? Because you don't want to have you want to really avoid the risk of somebody being biased in favor of one narrative or another. So we're really trying to come up with frameworks that are more robust for us to think about this as a problem of information dissemination and anomalous distribution. That's kind of where we are right now.
Renee, can you just to expand on that, and I'm going to come to Josh next, but just you talked about the problem of false positives,
Yeah.
the sort of challenge of this issue, and that maybe some things are left out there for too long in a way. Do you have a view on how to address that challenge?
I think that there is something to be said, and this might be a very controversial opinion, for reducing virality at times, right? So Mark Zuckerberg put out a graph that shows engagement. Like his comment was on moderation of content, right? As content gets more into the realm of where Facebook would take it down, engagement with that content increases. And so there's this interesting challenge of people are engaging with the stuff that's actually the most sensational or the most heinous or the most likely to actually get moderated away. And so when we look at this stuff, there is something to be said for, if a narrative is all of a sudden going viral, perhaps the platform diminishes it in feed temporarily, or I don't know what the solution is, because then people are going to say that they're censoring, right? And so this is the challenge, right, of that First Amendment concern of, well, what if it's real and it's going viral versus.
Let me give you a real world example.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Roy Moore election in Alabama.
Yeah.
I talked to the Facebook person who was responsible for making the decision to stuff stay up or not. He saw some false stuff but he knew if he took it down, he'd be accused of Facebook being against Republicans and so forth. So, and he literally used the word paralyzed. And so I think that gets to your point of difficult issues, no good answers, and the problem that these social media platforms have with censoring content. And so, and Putin knows that. Putin's a judo expert, black belt. He uses a person's strength against them. It's what he's trained to do in the KGB and so forth. Now he's using it in the social media. He's using America's strengths of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and turning that against us. And it's scary stuff, but that's why we have to educate. We've got to get out and talk to people and not just buy into the narrative that we have this huge vulnerabilities. No, we've identified the issue. We're coming after it in an American way that respects people's privacy, respects people's freedoms of speech, but that's what we're here for. That's why I love you having this forum to allow us to talk with experts like all of you.
Yeah, sort of saying it's complex and a critical issue seems like only the beginning. Surely we've got to get to some answers that are going to actually help us to address these issues. Fair enough. Before we go to questions, because I think we need to pretty quickly, I did want to surface another issue that's sort of related in my view. I think, Secretary Warner, you've tried and thought about mobile voting and sort of issues that are related to improving access, in a sense, from a technological perspective in this space. And I know that this is an area where there's, some controversy, and I thought to just try to surface it in a way that helps us understand how much the tension exists between efforts to try to increase access while at the same time maintain security can sometimes be framed in ways that are not necessarily the most useful for this debate. But I think, can I just give you a moment to talk about it and then hear from Josh? So, yeah, exactly, just to surface the different perspectives, I think.
Sure,
yeah.
I tackled this because my military background, I was in several locations where I couldn't vote. The U.S. mail simply doesn't deliver it. My children have all served, they've each had difficulties, so when I became elected Secretary of State, I said, I'm going to do my best to solve this. And I gave it to one of my elections directors and said, solve this so where you can vote without using electricity, the U.S. Postal Service, computers, scanners, all that, because on a hillside in Afghanistan or a submarine under the polar ice cap, you don't have access to those things. And so what they did is hooked up with Bradley Tusk, who is one of the people behind Uber, getting Uber accepted throughout the United States, and he wants to take the mobile voting across the spectrum. I wanted to use it, or that was the solution they gave me for allowing soldiers to vote. So here are some quick numbers. Out of 100 soldiers, you're going to have 65 who are registered to vote, 22 will request a ballot, 18 will receive that ballot, 14 will vote the ballot, and only 13 get their votes counted. So 13%. And this has been across decades. This is a dismal, it's abhorrent to me that our people who are out there fighting on the front lines and only 13% get their votes counted. When you hear the national averages are 50, 60, Minnesota gets 70% usually, okay? So the people that are putting their lives on the line to fight for democracy should have access to vote, and that's what this ought to do. So it's a cost-benefit analysis for that small segment of military and overseas voters, and in the pilot programs that we ran, we had people from 31 countries, including, these are West Virginians now, in Botswana, Uganda, Armenia, who would have never had that chance to vote if it hadn't been for this mobile solution. So I'm keeping it limited to that narrow sector because the cost-benefit analysis, the chances of a Russian hacking into somebody's military phone and changing that vote, I think is too remote, weighed against the benefit of giving those soldiers a voice and a chance to vote. So that's our story.
That's great. Yeah. Chuck, do you mind? Yeah.
Sure. So let me clear up a few things first. First, I can't resist, I have to say, I drove a 1990 Ford Festiva for 25 years, so I'm certainly familiar with getting the most I can out of an old. It was a sad day when the clutch died. I do want to be clear, though, that yes, we saw no evidence of any even attempts at tampering with actual votes in the 2016 election, and I'm not aware of any attempts in 2018. But we should be careful to distinguish between there being, am I still on? Mm-hmm. Distinguish between attempts and between vulnerabilities. That the system really does seem to be.
Mine.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to keep it about here. The system, even though we haven't seen attempts to tamper with votes, security experts are pretty well united in saying it could be done. But even if you don't think that, even if you're not concerned about that, many people are, and there is a lot of concern and distrust over the electoral system. And I agree completely that trust in the system is vital to democracy. And that's why I'm such a strong supporter of these strong auditing technologies, because what they do is engender trust. And it's not just sort of incremental improvements, especially this end-to-end verifiability. It democratizes the process. It puts control of verifying the votes back in the hands of voters themselves. So voters can check for themselves rather than having to depend on the courts to allow a recount that is conducted under certain circumstances that might be questionable. No, voters can check for themselves directly and be confident that their votes have been properly counted. That's why I'm so excited about this. I do want to address the issue of remote voting, mobile voting, because yes, it is a very serious concern about low rates of participation in some populations. There are a lot of things that we can do about it, and we're doing a much better job. Blank ballot delivery by internet is coming into favor, and it's increasing participation quite a lot. There are tremendous security vulnerabilities to return of completed ballots over the internet, way more than even the other issues that might be a concern today. In the National Academy's report, we're very clear about not recommending this in any circumstances, and the particular technology that's been used in a few places. And I can't believe that I'm about to say this, the word, broach the subject, but the subject is blockchains. That's what's being used in West Virginia. It's being experimented with in Denver now. And blockchain voting is just a terrible idea, I'm sorry to say. I've had to say this before, but anybody who's promoting blockchain voting either doesn't understand blockchains, doesn't understand voting, or is being dishonest. And of course, Secretary Warner, I certainly don't want to impugn your integrity. And of course, you're an expert in elections, but I'm the cryptographer, blockchains are cryptography. I really can know all the problems they have when they touch elections. They don't solve any of the real problems. They actually introduce new ones and make things worse. The real problems that need to be addressed are things like authorization to vote. Is this somebody who's allowed to vote and hasn't voted before? Anonymity or confidentiality of the votes themselves, integrity of the process, verifiability. Blockchains provide none of these things. You can actually add them to blockchains, add systems to blockchains to achieve all these things. But once you do, you can actually get to the point where you have something that's end-to-end verifiable, and the blockchain becomes superfluous. You can drop it off. You don't need it anymore. They just don't help. So, I'm sorry to have to put it this way, but I've seen all three of the cases that I mentioned, and the company that is promoting and selling these blockchain voting solutions, I think I have a pretty good sense of which of the three categories they're in. They're selling magic beans. They really are. It sounds good until you dig under the surface. And really, please look for other alternatives. Definitely increasing participation. Absolutely, there are good ways of doing that. But we have to do that in ways that maintain security and integrity. Thanks.
To clarify one issue, it's not that you're suggesting that there isn't a way to do mobile voting or other types of voting, recognizing that there is this issue that you mentioned at the end, in other words, providing the ballot ultimately to the election authority, in effect. But presumably, but you do have a concern with its application in the context of blockchain, but there might be other types of encryption that might actually support a system along those lines?
Thank you. Carefully passing the mic. So I was a part of a study done 4 years ago by the US Vote Foundation, looking specifically at internet voting and what is possible and what could be done. And this was a study with a wide variety of points of view of people coming into the study. There were some who said, internet voting will happen over my dead body. Never, never, ever, no way should it ever be done. And there were some who were saying, listen, this is inevitable. It's going to happen. We have a responsibility to make it as good as we possibly can. And despite that wide disparity, we were able to agree on certain things. First of all, it turns out that this end-to-end verifiable technology that I keep talking about is essential. That doing internet voting without that technology is just unconscionable. It's a terrible fit. There are so many vulnerabilities. But we also said that even with that, we're not ready yet. There are still other problems that have to be solved. We still need to ramp up other things to get to the point where we can even do it. So no, not today. We should not be doing internet voting, whether it's on a mobile device or on a laptop. And I'll go further than that and say that there's something that we're learning that's very, very surprising. I find very counterintuitive. There have been a few beginnings of studies, not really very full yet, about the effects of the availability of internet voting on voter participation. Because everybody thinks, I certainly thought, well, you make internet voting available, then you'll bring in a greater franchise, more people will vote, this is a good thing. That doesn't seem to be the case, surprisingly, very surprisingly. There are a few natural experiments going on in Ontario, Canada, for instance, where side-by-side towns, some are doing internet voting and some are not. And we're seeing some of these things. The availability of internet voting does get people to use it, but it doesn't seem to get more people to vote, surprisingly. So we shouldn't jump out and say, we have to do this to increase the franchise. Let's think very carefully about what it does, what benefits there are, and what risks there are.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions, and I think we only have about 5 minutes, but there's a mic. I see an individual over here, and there's a young woman coming to you with a microphone. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you for taking my question. As someone with 20 years of digital advertising experience, Renee, I guess I'm addressing this to you, I'm just absolutely astounded that there's still a question that Russian interference did not have some kind of influence or impact, not only on the outcome, but in general. We have decades of research in political science that tells us that propaganda works. Yeah. We have decades of research and billions of dollars in annual advertising that tell us that the most rational person can be persuaded to rethink what their best interests are and emotionally locked into something that's not in their best rational choice, their interests, excuse me. So why is that still a question?
Because it's been politicized in some ways, I would say. First, it's very hard to, as a researcher, without a sufficient degree of certainty. Here's what Facebook didn't provide. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of them. So the data sets were attributed by the platforms, first of all. So the assumption that something was Russian was made by people who were not me. It was made by the platforms. I could see that there were 900 comments on some posts. I couldn't see what the comments said. And that was for privacy concerns. But rather than anonymizing or just providing a corpus of text about how people responded, I have absolutely no insight into what people said about the content. So when a member of the Black community was served a meme saying, "I won't vote, will you?" and there are 900 comments under it, I actually can't see what any of those comments said. The people who can see what those comments were are the people within the social platforms. That information has not been made public. So that is, I would say, one of the key gaps in our understanding is, per the point about advertising, I think, I used to hear Tim O'Reilly refer to this as the Wanamaker problem, right? Half of my advertising doesn't work, I just don't know which half. So there's always been some variability, some sense that it's not completely clear, but per your point, yes. I spend a lot of time reading old books by Bernays and Lippmann and others, right? 1947 is when Crystallizing Public Opinion was written. people are the same. People have not changed. So you're absolutely right. If we believe that propaganda works, as we have believed for decades, then there is likely to have been some impact here. The question becomes, did it impact are likely to vote? And that does not seem to have happened based on the information that I received.
Questions? I see one over here.
As far away as possible.
I know, sorry.
Sorry.
Exactly. It's coming, it's coming. Thank you so much.
Somebody in that corner, get ready to ask.
Thank you. This is a question for Secretary of State Warner. I really appreciate I was looking at your PowerPoint that you referred to and how much detail you provide about Russian influence operations. I wonder, when you speak to audiences in West Virginia, do you face a problem with the fact that the president says it didn't happen? Because Putin told him it didn't happen. How do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, it's been very, welcomed by anybody who sees it. However, when I tried to take it to the Board of Education to put out to all the high schools, there was a resistance, and it was because, well, it touches on religion, it touches on sexual discrimination, it touches on race, and they didn't want to have people suing the school board because we were putting out something. And it shows you the difficulty in educating the public to get out there. So I don't have a specific response to the Trump response. Just, we're all familiar. I mean, he initially said there was massive voting fraud, okay, and they set up a commission. But as soon as he heard back from the Secretary of State, we went around in our meetings, and somebody said, it wasn't my state, red, blue, it doesn't matter, okay? And then the thing died. And so the bottom line in this is talking to trusted sources. That's, if you take away nothing else from my presentation today, the answer to this is talk to trusted sources. And those trusted sources are your county clerks who run the elections at the local level, the secretaries of state who do it at the state level, Department of Homeland Security. We're getting much better. And this is the power of one individual. What changed it in Department of Homeland Security was the transfer of one person who had elections background now into the DHS, and those walls came down, and things are improving much better. I don't have a specific answer to your question.
Okay, one more question, and I think this one's so conveniently located, I think, and we'll leave it at that.
Quick question. So Josh began by saying we can audit elections, but we can't necessarily prevent all interference, et cetera. That suggests that perhaps we should be ready to rerun elections. And so I ask you, as Secretary of State, and the other experts here on the panel, whether we should be, if the audit determines that there has in fact been election interference in the form of changing votes, not just influence campaigns, which I think are a little harder to understand and rerun votes for.
We already have that system in place. There are audits already taking place across all 50 states, all elections. It may not be as sophisticated as the risk limiting audit, but they do occur. And when there's a substantial deviation or something that may affect the outcome of election, that's when you take it to a court. A judge says, rerun the election, and you do rerun the election. Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the panel.